Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're covering a rapidly evolving set of crises, from devastating Israeli strikes on Tehran and their far-reaching consequences, to the global economic shockwaves now hitting your wallet, and a landmark moment for justice at the International Criminal Court. Let's get right to it. The people of Tehran have lived through another harrowing night. Israeli forces launched a fresh wave of heavy strikes on the Iranian capital, just one day after bombing runs targeted the country's fuel reserves, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the sky that quite literally turned day into night. Residents have described scenes of panic and fear, with one telling reporters, "Our hearts were shaking." The scale of these attacks marks a significant escalation in the conflict between Israel and Iran, a confrontation that many analysts had long feared but hoped to avoid. Civilian areas near strategic targets have reportedly been affected, though precise casualty figures remain difficult to confirm amid the chaos. Iran's government has vowed retaliation, raising the specter of an even broader regional war. The international community is watching with deep concern. The United Nations Security Council is expected to convene in the coming hours to address the escalation. What remains unclear is whether diplomatic channels can gain any traction while bombs are still falling. For millions of ordinary Iranians, the immediate reality is one of disrupted lives, damaged infrastructure, and profound uncertainty about what comes next. The World Health Organization has issued an urgent warning about a disturbing phenomenon now affecting parts of Iran, so-called black rain. This toxic precipitation is the direct result of Israeli strikes on Iran's oil facilities, which sent massive columns of smoke and particulate matter into the atmosphere. That contamination is now falling back to Earth in the form of darkened, chemical-laden rainfall. The WHO says this black rain poses significant health risks, particularly for vulnerable populations including children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing respiratory conditions. Exposure can cause skin irritation, breathing difficulties, and contamination of water supplies and agricultural land. It's an environmental and public health crisis layered on top of an active military conflict. Health officials in Iran are urging residents to stay indoors and avoid contact with rainwater. But in a country already under enormous strain, compliance is difficult. The WHO is calling for immediate humanitarian access to assess the full scope of the damage. This situation draws uncomfortable parallels to environmental disasters in past conflicts, from the oil fires of the Gulf War to chemical exposure in other theaters. The long-term health consequences could linger for years, even after the fighting stops. The war in Iran isn't just a regional crisis. It's now hitting travelers around the world directly in the wallet. Global airlines are sharply increasing ticket prices as the conflict drives oil prices to levels not seen in years. With Iran being one of the world's major oil producers, the disruption to its production and export infrastructure has sent shockwaves through energy markets. Jet fuel, which represents one of the largest operating costs for airlines, has surged in price, and carriers say they have no choice but to pass those costs along. Some routes, particularly long-haul international flights, have seen price increases described as staggering. Airlines are also rerouting flights to avoid Iranian and broader Middle Eastern airspace, adding flight time, fuel burn, and further cost. Industry analysts warn this could dampen travel demand heading into what is typically a busy season. For consumers already dealing with inflation in other areas of life, this is yet another financial pressure point. Aviation industry groups are calling on governments to consider temporary relief measures, but so far, no coordinated response has materialized. The bottom line, as long as this conflict continues, flying is going to cost more. A damning new report from Amnesty International accuses Israel of systematically denying women and girls in Gaza the basic conditions necessary for survival. The global human rights organization describes what it calls a deliberate erosion of health services, safety, and essential infrastructure, and it says this isn't collateral damage. Amnesty characterizes it as a deliberate act of war, specifically targeting women and girls. The report details how the destruction of hospitals, the collapse of maternal health care, and the near-total breakdown of sanitation have created conditions that are incompatible with life for the most vulnerable. Women in Gaza are reportedly giving birth without medical assistance, without clean water, and without safe shelter. Amnesty is calling on the international community to take immediate action, including arms embargoes and accountability mechanisms. Israel has consistently rejected such characterizations, arguing that its military operations target militant infrastructure, but the humanitarian data paints a grim picture that is increasingly difficult to dispute. International legal experts say the findings could factor into ongoing proceedings at international courts. For the women and girls living through this, the legal debates are abstract. Their reality is one of daily survival against extraordinary odds. The International Energy Agency is in active discussions with its member states about a potentially significant intervention, the coordinated release of strategic oil reserves. IEA chief convened the talks to assess market conditions as the war in Iran continues to drive global energy uncertainty to alarming levels. The strategic petroleum reserves held by IEA member nations, including the United States, Japan, and major European economies, exist precisely for moments like this, supply disruptions caused by geopolitical crises. A coordinated release would aim to stabilize prices and prevent the kind of economic damage that unchecked oil spikes can cause. However, the decision is far from straightforward. Some member states are cautious about depleting reserves when the conflict shows no signs of ending, fearing they may need those stockpiles even more in the weeks ahead. Others argue that acting now could prevent a deeper economic crisis. Energy markets are watching these talks closely. Even the signal that a release is being considered has had a modest calming effect on futures trading. But analysts warn that without a resolution to the underlying conflict, any reserve release would be a temporary fix at best. The world's energy security architecture is being tested in real time. The war in Ukraine continues with deadly consequences. A Russian attack on the city of Sloviansk has killed at least 4 people. A stark reminder that even as global attention shifts to the Middle East, the conflict in Eastern Europe grinds on with devastating human cost. Sloviansk, located in the Donetsk region, has been a frequent target throughout the more than 4-year war. Both Ukrainian and Russian officials are claiming battlefield successes in recent days, though independent verification of those claims remains difficult. Ukraine says its forces have repelled advances in several sectors, while Russia claims progress in contested areas along the front line. The reality on the ground, as is often the case, likely falls somewhere in between. What is clear is that civilians continue to bear an enormous burden. Infrastructure in cities like Sloviansk has been repeatedly damaged, and residents who remain face constant danger. International aid organizations report growing fatigue among donor nations, even as the humanitarian needs remain acute. Western military support for Ukraine continues, but questions about long-term sustainability persist. For the people of Sloviansk mourning their dead tonight, the geopolitical calculations matter far less than the loss they're enduring. Israel has released dramatic footage, it says, shows the moment a missile fired by Hezbollah struck a satellite and radar station on Israeli territory. The video, shared by the Israeli military, depicts a direct hit on what appears to be a significant piece of surveillance infrastructure. If confirmed, the strike represents a notable tactical success for Hezbollah and underscores the group's growing missile capabilities. The radar and satellite station would have played a role in Israel's broader air defense and intelligence gathering network, making it a high-value target. Israel's decision to release the footage is itself noteworthy. It may be intended to build public support for continued or expanded military operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. The strike highlights the multi-front nature of the current conflict. While Israel is engaged in operations against Iran and continues its campaign in Gaza, Hezbollah remains a potent threat along its northern border. Military analysts say Hezbollah's arsenal, much of it supplied by Iran, includes precision-guided munitions capable of reaching deep into Israeli territory. The group has demonstrated a willingness to use them. This incident is likely to intensify calls within Israel's security establishment for a more aggressive posture toward Hezbollah, even as the country's military resources are stretched across multiple theaters. Thousands of miles from the Middle East, another form of justice is playing out. The International Criminal Court in The Hague is moving toward a landmark judgment on the brutal drug war waged under former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. For years, Duterte's campaign against drug suspects resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings. Estimates range from several thousand to tens of thousands of deaths, many of them in impoverished communities. Victims, families, who have long sought accountability, are now seeing a genuine path to justice. The ICC investigation has been years in the making, complicated by the Philippines' withdrawal from the court's jurisdiction under Duterte's leadership. However, the ICC has maintained that it retains authority over crimes committed while the country was a member. This case is being closely watched as a test of the ICC's ability to hold powerful leaders accountable, particularly in cases involving state-sanctioned violence. Duterte has denied wrongdoing, claiming his campaign was a legitimate law enforcement operation. But human rights organizations have documented widespread abuses, including killings of unarmed suspects and the targeting of the urban poor. Whatever the outcome, this proceeding sends a message that even popular leaders who authorize mass violence may eventually face scrutiny on the world stage. As the conflict in Iran intensifies, a pointed question is gaining traction among geopolitical analysts. To what extent are Iran's vast natural resources shaping American strategic calculations? Iran sits atop some of the world's largest proven oil and natural gas reserves. It's also a critical energy supplier to China, making it a pivotal player in the global competition between Washington and Beijing. Critics of U.S. policy argue that resource considerations have always been a factor in American engagement with the Middle East, and that the current conflict is no exception. They point to the strategic value of influencing or disrupting Iran's energy exports as a lever against Chinese economic growth. Supporters of the current approach counter that U.S. involvement is driven by legitimate security concerns, including Iran's nuclear program and its support for proxy groups across the region. The truth, as with most geopolitical questions, is likely complex. What's undeniable is that whoever controls or influences Iran's energy output holds enormous leverage in global affairs. As this war continues, expect this debate to intensify, particularly as oil prices climb and the economic consequences become harder for ordinary citizens everywhere to ignore. The intersection of energy, economics, and military strategy has rarely been more visible. Tonight we've covered an extraordinary range of developments, from the devastating strikes on Tehran and their environmental and economic fallout, to the humanitarian crisis facing women in Gaza, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and a historic moment of accountability at The Hague. These are stories that demand our continued attention. I'm grateful you spent this time with us. Stay informed and stay safe. Good night.